Hello.
Hi.
I'll go ahead and start off with our first question. How do specialist teams work on differently sized teams? Specifically, if you've only got three people for a team, how do you address front end, back end, security, ops, etc.?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say that when you're thinking about a team of specialists and trying with limited resources, I'm guessing really the question is you only have 3 headcount. How do you cover all of your bases? Part of it is finding out what people's experiences are. Maybe you do have that comb-shaped person. Like, remember, I was talking about various wells of experience. So you might want that 3 different wells. Maybe somebody has some front end experience and some back end experience. Let's say they're using JavaScript. So you're using Node and on the back end and you're using React on the front end. The patterns are slightly different, but there is a depth of knowledge there. So that might be one specialist that you might use. Really, it's kind of talking and figuring out what are your holes and how can you be creative in getting there. The idea is to say that I'm not going to force someone to learn something new, unless they maybe want to, but I'm not going to force them to learn something new and fill in all the gaps for my team without being aware that one person can't know everything. Like, I'm not a security expert. I know some ops, I know some dev. So those are my specialties, let's say. So maybe you just kind of evaluate from there.
Yeah, so it's all about like finding the spots where those people fit into those where that
Exactly.
expertise lies and how you can
Right.
use that. Yeah.
Right. And not, knowing that someone has to have some depth of knowledge somewhere. This is where
hmm
that people-shaped people comes in. We
hmm
have depth of knowledge that might be slightly different. I know some devs who are amazing at security.
hmm
Maybe they cover both because that's the resources that you have. But you eventually, as a manager, I would continue to advocate for, I'd like a specialist role here. I'd need more resources. And again, that's all about communicating, speaking up, having those same conversations that you might have with your employees. You want to have those with your peers and with your boss as a manager to try to advocate for your team.
Awesome. Yeah. Excellent. So on to the next one.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on how specialists versus generalists can work for on-call rotations?
That's another great question. So, to me, that when you have an on-call rotation, partially an on-call is someone's going to make an attempt to fix something, and if they need help, they're going to page other people. It shouldn't be wholly set on one person. So, like, let's take the example of an application falls over and on-call happens to be an ops person. Well, they might not know the code. They might not know the architectural pattern that could have caused the memory leak, that could have created this problem, et cetera, et cetera. I think that we all have a little bit of specialization, so there might be a case where it's a pretty easy fix or you know enough to do a duct tape fix until the next team can come in and really fix it for real. But it shouldn't be that you are expected to fix everything like you're some kind of miracle worker. On call rarely is life and death. Unless perhaps you're working in like the military and, or you are running some kind of system that keeps a hospital up and running.
Mhm.
Don't feel like you have to be a hero in on call to fix everything by yourself. And I think some of the best teams, I'll be honest, and some people are going to argue with me on this one. I think multiple people should be on call. I think you should have a dev on call. You should have a security person on call, and that rotation should be there. And they should be willing to come on and try to help fix the situation enough until the workday starts the next time.
Yeah, yeah. So building your rotation such that you have that depth of experience when you need it
Exactly.
across the board.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean, it might be one person as a generalist to start. It's
Mhm.
not saying that, you have to have all 3 people answer the page at the exact same time and it's a miracle. No, it might be just something where you take a look at, oh, it just needed to be rebooted. That's
Mhm.
fine. That's something we can do. But if there isn't a clear path forward to fix the problem, go ahead and page somebody else. It's okay.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
what everybody's there for.
yeah. Excellent. That's why you have teams with different sets of functionalities. Yeah, exactly. Makes sense. Yeah. So for you talked about selling it kind of up the management chain a little bit. Do you have any specific tips for wanting for trying to sell this up to like VPs to C levels for a team that wants when you want them to have a flexible team? So.
Yeah. It's I'm not going to say this is easy. I first want to state that right now. It's always hard to sell that you want to spend more money, especially on another person. But my argument would be that you need to demonstrate the value that you'll bring with a new person. So part of that is identifying ways to measure velocity. So how can I deliver this feature faster? How can I make sure my uptime is better? Sometimes it gets a little bit creative. And the example I'm going to give is not exactly the same scenario, but it's similar. Back when I used to work on a documentation team, my manager's manager was amazing at this. She was able to go to people and say that if you add another person working on this documentation, here is how many support tickets you're going to reduce that people have to actually touch, because we're able to pass on documentation that is worthwhile. So you notice the support tickets are high on this project. Well, it's because the documentation doesn't have a dedicated writer. If you add a dedicated writer, if you look at these 5 projects, here's an example. These 5 projects on average reduce support tickets by about 5% or 10%, something like that. Sometimes you do have to get creative, but numbers speak. Being able to prove that velocity is really how you do it. And then also, this is a odd tip, but I'm going to put it out there anyway. Think about when you're asking. If you know that your boss's boss is going into an executive meeting that always makes them cranky afterwards, don't ask that day. Pick a different day. Yeah. Pick a day when, like, if you know they're always really, really happy after their first cup of coffee, wait till they're done their first cup of coffee, then send the email. Then, schedule that Zoom call to be just right on the money to hit that time frame when they're willing to listen. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect timing, but you want to hit when the iron is not hot, but willing to hear you.
Yeah, most receptive.
That analogy doesn't really work, but that's okay.
That's people and steel and stuff.
It's close.
Yeah,
it's fine.
It works. Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah. So picking the right time and then also using like a data-driven approach seems. Yeah.
I find that's the easiest. You can also kind of switch the numbers a little bit. Like if you say that I think I'm going to lose X amount of people, that we're going to have to then build up headcount if we don't do this. I've seen teams that are absolutely exhausted because they are constantly on call because they don't have enough people, or they've been asked to be generalists when really they are specialists and they can't fix the problem and they can never raise the right person. And so I can point to that and say, I'm about to lose probably at least 20% of my ops team to the fact that they are absolutely exhausted and the hiring market is really hot right now. Mm-hmm. If I'm going to lose that 20%, think about how much money is going to be spent having to recruit, hire, and train up the next team, especially on like a very specialized code base or a specialized stack, anything along that line. So use the numbers you have. If that's the number that you have, use it. Find a way to weave that narrative and explain it up the chain.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, making it so that they understand the kind of what's at stake and what the problem is they're trying to get in front of.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Awesome. So let's say that the champagne factor has hit one of the specialists. What can you do to prevent that tribal knowledge from going out the door? Sort of preemptively. Prevention,
right? Mm-hmm. That's my best answer is don't let someone become the expert on one specific thing without someone else being there to also be an expert. Make sure that you have regular lunch and learns. Make sure that you regularly have people shadowing other people, even if they think they know it. It's always helpful to have somebody else looking, checking a PR, for example, doing a code review. One of my favorites, actually, this was something I was taught back when I used to work at Rackspace, and there was a dev there. I'm going to call him out. Jay Parlar is amazing. He brought in this idea, or maybe gave us all really this institutionalized idea of a Zoom code review. Everyone joined and went through the code together, and everyone was encouraged to ask questions, especially junior devs. Now, this was on the dev side, but the idea was that there are no stupid questions. People will hear me say, I don't believe in stupid questions, only smart-ass answers. So that's really the way that I look at it. But people were encouraged to ask questions because you have to learn the code base. And so by doing that kind of everybody's there, everybody's asking questions, you reduce that champagne factor because everyone gets some kind of experience doing something. So part of it is encouraging your senior engineers, especially, to say, I know you can do this in like 10 minutes. I'm going to make the space for you to do this with a junior engineer for like an hour to make sure they go through and deploy something. They learn how this works so that it's not completely opaque. And then, of course, documentation, which if you're not doing documentation at this point, I don't know how much I can say to you to encourage you to do it, but that is possibly the biggest foundation of any kind of mitigation of the champagne factor. Mm-hmm. Just awesome. Saying.
Yeah. Documentation will survive long past those Zoom sessions but getting that kind of conversation started and building the rapport there.
And build the habit too. Mm-hmm. Like build the habit of updating your documentation. One of the best ways of doing onboarding is saying, I'm expecting you to fix anything in this documentation that doesn't make sense while you're going through it. Yeah. So typically, if I have somebody starting on a team, I hand them the documentation and say, if you have problems with it, don't just come to me. Update the documentation because we're wrong somewhere. Mm-hmm. I want you to tell me where that is.
Yeah. So, and that's the best time for them to exercise that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other, we're kind of like feeding questions in. So I have a slightly rhetorical one. What do you call shoes made out of banana peels?
Oh, wait, this was actually in an email. I don't know.
Slippers.
Not the Yellow Submarine. Slippers. Nice. Very nice. I happen to love really horribly punny jokes, so send them to me. They're like my favorite thing.
I'll give everyone a little bit of a behind the scenes glance at the end of every single one of our organizers meeting. We have a dad joke of the day.
It just makes it so much more fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
It builds up that empathy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it builds the connections and everything. Yeah. So going back to like doing those Zoom sessions and kind of and documentation and stuff like that, should those Zoom sessions be recorded? Is that a viable way of doing that, or?
I think they should. I think they should. The actual final result for those kind of Zoom code reviews is already in the PR. So the comments that come out in the end that explain something typically are already there. Some of us would always actually put the questions already in the review so that as we were going through Zoom, we would answer the questions live. Kind of depends on how you do it. I absolutely think you should have them recorded and archived somewhere so someone new who maybe learns better by video can go back and watch them. Some people learn better reading. Some people learn better listening. It's about meeting people where they are in that case. So I would ensure that any major questions get answered on the PR so that it's documented in writing. And also, if like you make a change and you know it's a patch, you really should leave a code comment. That's my personal opinion. If you're ops and you're trying to do something and you do something different than a playbook, you should write it down somewhere. Security, like if you're ignoring a CVE, same thing. Testing, if you're skipping part of the test, you should explain why. Like all of those things are important to document. But the major stuff, you don't have to write down every single thing because I think people go a little crazy. But you should make it so clear that someone who maybe doesn't want to go back and watch the video gets the gist of everything going on.
And just when you mentioned like having documentation that kind of meets people where they are, it's people-shaped documentation.
It is.
Yeah.
People-shaped documentation is a wonderful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right, I think we got about 5 minutes left, so try and sneak one last one in here. So if I'm a manager in an org missing a specialist, example, maybe security, and that specialty represents a bunch of unknown unknowns, which makes it very difficult to advocate for headcount. Do you have any recommendations to be able to measure, to prove that lack of security is a cost risk? How do you get from unknowns to?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. I'm going to say, I'm going to do that horrible thing that everybody hates. It depends. I guess it kind of depends on your organization. If your organization overall has this, but your team doesn't, maybe you go to a peer manager. Maybe you go to another part of your org and like kind of ask for their data, see if they have anything to share with you. So that would be like my first attempt at something. But let's say that you're in an org that has never had security. You're a startup, let's say. I love startups, but let's be honest, we all do this, right?
Yeah.
I'd say in this scenario, go find research. There's a lot of people who do this kind of thing for a living. They explain why. They talk about what this could mean. And they have analysts that do statistics. Now, I have to admit, statistics and I aren't friends. I definitely believe Mark Twain's quote or misattributed quote about lies and statistics, just saying. But statistics can help you in this case if you use it and you make clear where it came from. So you're very transparent about where your numbers are coming from so that people can go and research it themselves so that they believe you. Again, this is a trust question. But the other thing I would do is start seeing if you can look for similar situations. One of the ones I love to point to is actually supply chain attacks. Let's say that, because we have so many of these, right? Yeah. And they're all over the news and things like that. Go take a look at those case studies and say like, okay, well, when this happened to, the big one recently was SolarWinds, right? When this happened to SolarWinds, what did their stock look like? What did their reputation in the community look like? How did things change? Did they lose anybody important in terms of their employees? What kind of stuff happened to them as a result? Can I use any of that to explain why we never want to be in that situation? So let's not, and just hire somebody. Think about like the cost benefit analysis here.
Yeah.
And then if you're really at that point where you can't find any data, you can't find anybody else to give you anecdotal data, and you can't even like figure out some fancy way of making statistics work for you, and no one is still listening to you about that, maybe you need to question whether this company actually knows what it's doing.
Whether they're
sorry, like that's the best answer I can give, right?
Yeah.
Now you might get the answer that, hey, that's not a priority for us right now. We can't afford it. That happens too. Archive that and say like, okay, I'm going to revisit, and like tell them, I'm going to revisit this again in 3 months, in next quarter. Make it clear that you're putting a deadline on it, and then follow up on that deadline, just like you would do for any other major thing that you're trying to do. Like if you're kind of working with a recruiter and the recruiter says, well, not this time, not this round, we're not going to hire you now. You can say, okay, well then I'm going to follow up with you in 3 months and see if you all are interested in me now. Yeah. That seems kind of like a very, very old version of recruiting at this point because the market is so easy to get hired, I guess. But
yeah.
I hope that makes sense. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's, well, like you said, it's a very challenging question to answer. There's a lot of different ways to, a variety of approaches to it. So awesome. Well, thank you so much, Laura. Thank you for your talk, and thank you for doing the QA on stream and everything with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited I got to be here.
Oh, hey.
And by the way, if anybody has any more questions, I am in Discord. I will be here all day tomorrow. Reach out to me there. Or if you're watching this later, always reach out to me on Twitter. So
awesome. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.